All right, welcome to the Fourth Arcanum lecture on the Emperor. Now, the Emperor on the fourth card is alone, without court or retinue. His throne is in no way to be found in a room of the imperial palace, but rather in the open in an uncultivated field, not located in a town. A meager clump of grass by his foot, there is as the whole imperial court as the witness of his imperial splendor. But the clear sky is spread above him. He is a silhouette on the background of the sky, alone in the presence of the sky. This is how the emperor is. Now, if these initial words from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot don't give you this instant sense of the emperor being a transcendental factor within the Arcanum, we'll explore how Tomberg sees power and authority in a way that addresses earthly issues, but takes a very different approach to the nature of what authority really means and how it should play out in our lives, how it should rule the world, not by compulsion, not by force, but by a surrender of the world to the ideals expressed within it. And there's an initial letter here from Tomberg that I think sets us up nicely for exploring this trump, this tarot trump of the major arcana that has been vastly overlooked. It's one of the most considered to be sort of brushed over in people's explorations. I think that's because there's a lot of issues these days with reconciling ourselves to the ideas of power and authority, especially after the 20th century. So in a letter Tomberg wrote to his friends in 1967, he said, "My meditations on the tarot are no scientific undertaking. Rather, they are a repeated and wide-ranging effort by means of the symbolism of the Hermetic tradition to enter again deeply into the all-encompassing stream of the Catholic tradition in such a way that through a shift in perspective, through the purifying atonement, the Catholic and the Hermetic traditions might be seen as one in harmony with each other." This brings up the most fundamental question, of course, in Meditations on the Tarot, which you might consider to be, how does the Catholic tradition reconcile itself with the Hermetic tradition? Because Catholic is Christian, Hermetic is fundamentally pagan. Let's take a quick look at these three questions. This is some background that will be very helpful for understanding, since a lot of these basic facts aren't really known much anymore as we're in a post-Christian world. So what is the Catholic tradition? Well, it's evolved and undergone various changes through its history from its beginnings up to 1967, which is when Tomberg wrote this letter. And this is very important timing because of the council that had just occurred. Here's some main differences. First, in the early church, in its early years, the Catholic Church was a small community of believers centered around the teachings of Jesus Christ. They were the followers of the way of Jesus of Nazareth, of course. It faced persecution from the Roman Empire, but gradually gained recognition and influence. As it developed, it needed doctrine, and this is where things got interesting and very political. Over time, the Catholic Church developed its doctrines and teachings through ecumenical councils and the writings of theologians. What's considered Catholic today by the World Council of Churches is often actually whether you accept the first 7 councils of the church. They actually classify not only Roman Catholics and Orthodox and Anglicans as Catholic, but they classify even Lutherans as Catholic. So that's a fun little tidbit a lot of people don't realize. The theological versus the political is quite a difference. Now, important developments include the formulation, of course, of the Nicene Creed and the definition of the Trinity and the establishment of the canon of Scripture. Fast forward hundreds of years to the Big Schism in 1054, the Great Schism as it's called, leading to the separation of the Catholic Church in the West, the Roman Catholic, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This division resulted from theological, cultural, and political differences. And if you've read Aaron Leach's Secrets of the Magical Grimoires, apparently also lyrical, melodic, and poetic differences. He cites an instance of a poem, I believe, that played a role in the Filioque controversy. So there was a lot to it and a lot going on, a lot of different agendas competing for power and control, of course. Then we move up to the Reformation 500 years later. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation challenged certain practices and teachings of the Catholic Church, and this led to the formation of Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and the schisms and denominations continued to proliferate after that. And this all the way up to modern day evangelicalism, which of course has delightfully brought back Christian folk magic in all kinds of wonderful ways. Just don't call it magic. Now, the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, was the significant event in Catholic history because it addressed the theological and disciplinary issues raised by the Protestant Reformation. So this is the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, when we see the Jesuits come up. And this is what's really, really important to understanding a lot of the debates around Tomberg and Rudolf Steiner and their views of Roman Catholicism. Rudolf Steiner was actually a Catholic, despite the fact that anthroposophy in general is very anti-Catholic in practice, if not in theory. They're very opposed to Jesuitism, especially, but so was Tomberg. That doesn't mean they threw the baby out with the bathwater when it came to the mystical or spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. They just separated the Jesuitism that occurred from his movement from the saint himself. So that's something where people get caught up often when they're trying to understand Tomberg's and Steiner's view of these people. The Protestant Reformation initiated reforms within the Catholic Church, including clarifying doctrines, addressing abuses, and emphasizing the importance of education and seminary formation. This is also when the Catholic Church really started clamping down on the celibacy issue. Up until the Counter-Reformation, it was common practice for clergy to have concubines and wives and kids. Most bishops had wives and kids living in their manses. And this is just something that we've sort of lost knowledge of in common understanding, but it was they were very loosey goosey about the whole celibacy thing until Protestants started accusing them of being lax in their convictions. Moving up to the Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council in 1869 to 1870, it was convened to address various issues, including the role of the Pope, the papal infallibility thing, and the relationship between faith and reason as we moved into the scientific era. Further into the scientific era, I should say. It was well underway. So this council affirmed the authority of the Pope and defined the doctrine of papal infallibility under the conditions of speaking ex cathedra and a few other things. Of course, it's only been used twice, I believe, once for this purpose to declare that it was so, and a second time to confirm the bodily assumption of Mary into heaven, I believe. Yeah, other than that, it hasn't been used too much. The reason all of this is important is because it leads us up to Vatican II, which happened in 1962 to 1965, and this is where we get very famous documents like Lumen Gentium, the light of the people, and a lot of reaffirmations about both the commitment to ecumenism and sort of a new opening up of the church to other Christian or ecclesial communities, as they call them. Even in the Second Vatican Council, they can't find their way to calling other Christians churches. They call them ecclesial communities. And a lot of Protestants, of course, were like, you guys sort of, they went up to the finish line, but didn't cross it, in the view of a lot of non-Catholic Christians. They could have gone a bit further. In a lot of ways, they went too far. And certainly Tomberg has been accused of thinking that they went too far with the eradication of the Old Mass and the institution of colloquial language being used wherever Mass was done. So the church dropped the Latin Mass, switched to the common language. To that extent, it's quite interesting that Roman Catholic priests actually have a harder time getting permission to do Latin masses than other clergy. So Anglican clergy can just do a Latin mass if they want, pretty much any time. Most clergy can if they want to. Roman Catholic clergy are the only ones that now have to get permission to do their own original traditional mass, which is all kinds of hilarious. So Tomberg definitely had some thoughts and feelings on the Second Vatican Council, but he never really wrote down what those were. And I think that's a good thing, because it allows us to, cut him some slack, given that was such a tumultuous time, and there's a really vast divisions between, like, many branches of the Roman Catholic Church split off at that point, and we got the Tridentinists and other denomination, or sort of not denominations, but congregations within the Roman Catholic Church that wanted to go back to the older, more historical rituals. They aim to renew and update the church's practices and teachings to better engage with the world, but in those changes, they also lost a lot of the liturgical mysticism and more traditional values. You could think of it in moral terms, but that's really not what it's necessarily about. Oh yes, and you can always drop questions into the chat as I go along, and I'll check them at the end and answer them as I can. Yeah, a bishop. You actually need a bishop. Yeah, I was part of a denomination when I was practicing Roman Catholic that did there is one a set of priests that are trained still in that. I forget the name, but there's an order that trains priests and they only do that, and that's all they do. Priests with who could run special parishes just for that purpose, to preserve and celebrate the traditional mass. Of course, the mass really changed many times, and one of the reasons you could argue that the Vatican II mass was a good thing is because the simplicity of it actually is a return to more biblical New Testamental Christian practice. So it was into this milieu of the 60s that Tomberg was writing and putting together this monumental work of meditations on the Tarot. And his goal in moving to the Catholic Church was because he saw it as a universal church, as the Ecclesia Universalis, and really thought that it would be an effective vessel to take his teachings into the world. Of course, presenting magic to Catholics and encouraging ideas of reincarnation, mystical interpretations of church teachings was something that he thought Catholics would appreciate, and many do. Of course, many condemn his work, but people like Cardinal Hans Urs von Balthasar, of course, wrote the foreword to this Meditations on the Tarot, and there's a famous photo of the Tubble hardcover copy of it on the Pope of St. John Paul II that I saw that picture going around 25 years ago. Never knew if it was real or not, but given that it was going around back then, it's unlikely, I think, that it was fake. I'm sure Pope John Paul was given a copy and probably might have even read some of it. Who knows? He was a big reader, of course. Now, the challenging idea here is the unifying of Catholicism with Hermetic traditions, because Hermetic traditions are inherently pagan. Were they Christianized? There's some debate, and I haven't seen if there's been any new research on that, but there are many people that make arguments that some of the apostles went and participated in a Christianized form of Hermeticism in Alexandria, but I don't know if that's actually something we can verify. What's interesting when we consider this confluence of Christianity and paganism is that they did come from the same source, and there's a tremendous movement these days now questioning if the very fundamental bases for the idea of monotheistic religions. For example, many Jewish scholars in Israel are questioning whether Israel was ever monotheistic. I believe the people at the Hammurabi channel on YouTube are digging into that quite a bit. Tomberg's views on Vatican II are much debated. Some people think he was opposed to the modernizing aspects of it, or some of the social teachings. Some people think he had a problem with the ecumenism, but I think that's not really likely, given he was practicing as a Roman Catholic throughout this time, but also going to Eastern Orthodox masses as well. And he really did have a very idealistic view of the role of the churches, and was quite pragmatic when it came to his decision to convert to it, which is partly what led to a lot of his rejection by the anthroposophical and community of Rudolf Steiner. I know that's a heavy way to start out a lecture, but I'm sure you could handle it. It's just sort of essential, since we can't assume this information anymore. We can't assume that knowledge like we could have 50 years ago. So power and authority. The card teaches us, according to Tomberg, in the first instance, that the emperor has renounced compulsion and violence. He has no weapons. His right hand holds the scepter forward, on which his gaze is fixed, and his left hand holds his tightly fastened belt. He is neither standing nor sitting. He is simply leaning back against a lowered throne and has only one foot placed on the ground. His legs are crossed. The shield adorned with an eagle rests on the ground at his side. Lastly, he is wearing a large and heavy crown. Now, we'll consider each of the aspects of this card later, but now let's consider how just Tomberg understands authority. Tomberg begins his letter 4 on the fourth arcanum, the emperor, by asserting authority is endowed, essentially by competence and accomplishment, and is a necessary feature for anyone who wants to begin a spiritual school. At higher degrees of the fusion of mysticism with gnosis and the productive power of magic, as Tomberg literally says, although his translation, of course, is Robert Powell's translation from the original French. So I guess not literally, but you know what I mean? He says that a person at a higher level of that can lay down the law, literally lay down the law. What does he mean? I think we are meant to find the first claim to be reasonable, if not extremely idealistic. We have far more charlatans in the world, it seems, than sincere spiritual teachers willing to struggle with rigorous honesty, while Tomberg's latter assertion, I think, is meant to shock or at the very least challenge our comfort. The idea that anyone, of course, of spiritual status could lay down the law is a daunting concept, right? I mean, we expect it these days from politicians, but not from spiritual leaders, right? They're meant to be so open-minded. And so this is what's leading us to the true understanding of Tomberg's view on the emperor, which I think it might not be what you expect, unless you've read the chapter, of course, which you should all do. There's many sub conversations going on within this text. His comparison with the crucifixion and Simtsum alone is worth the read. So he's trying to shock us, I think, when he says that someone who's achieved a high state of the fusion of gnosis and mysticism and magic can lay down the law. Certainly, he means to put us on guard at the very outset and set our minds into that sort of questioning dance where we know we should trust our partner for the sake of potentially gaining some new insight in maneuvering across the floor, as it were. So if, as Tomberg says, it is authority alone which is the true and unique power of law, then that means compulsion is only expedient when authority is absent. So in the absence of true authority that we can actually, the kind of authority, this is not just authority for fear of punishment, this is authority that you place in someone. When that's absent, when there's no one that you can give authority to, then compulsion takes over and fills in that gap. Nowhere a void, right? So what is this authority to Tomberg? Well, he says, delightfully, that authority is where there is present the breath of sacred magic, filled by the rays of light of gnosis, emanated from the profound fire of mysticism. There, compulsion is superfluous. Beautiful, right? He says this again in less poetic terms throughout the book, throughout the chapter, but I thought that you would enjoy that view of how he sees things. And again, the idea is here that through the accessing higher spiritual values, we can deal away with some of the confusion and affliction that authority causes in its non transcendental state. I think transcendental might be an accurate word for that in this case. So authority is a tall order for Tomberg, a very tall order. If it sounds like how could anyone achieve that, you're on the right track. But we do see very clearly in our own world, especially in recent years, how rapidly laws lose all value, meaning, and power when the authority behind them is false and unearned, incompetent, or most frequently simply corrupt. While governmental authority must be surely different somehow from personal authority, the issue of competence denoted by Tomberg is relevant in both cases. So as letter 4 says, at the outset, to be something, to know something, and to be capable of something is what endows a person with authority. We cannot help, of course, but hear echoes of the credo of most every magician: to know, to dare, to will, and to be silent. But also echoes of Aleister Crowley and his conviction that if every man and woman followed each his true will, which for Crowley, of course, was the higher and divine will within us, rather than the egoic personal will of desire, or that which springs from the uncontrolled id, if you want to take a Freudian or psychological approach. So in that case, compulsory laws would be unnecessary. Even Crowley thought this. Hence the Thelemic adage, of course, love is the law, love under will, and do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Crowley's book of the law, which birthed really the 20th century's magical religion, Thelema, which is Greek for will, envisioned the New Age as the Aeon of Horus. But unlike Crowley's Horus drawing a flaming sword and striking the master chord, Tomberg points us toward the scepter held by the emperor, enthroned in the Marseille deck with the same eagle-crested shield we saw with the third arcanum, the Empress. Now, while the Empress represents sacred magic in Meditations on the Tarot, the Emperor represents what Tomberg calls the Hermetic philosophical sense and describes this sense as the defining feature of the Hermeticist. We should recall that Hermeticist is the technical term used to refer to those who draw the Hermetica and its teachings through its Renaissance revival by Christianizers like Ficino, Pico, and Reuchlin, etc. So while the term Hermetist commonly refers to those influenced by the writings and teachings of the Hermetica in their original pagan context, Hermetica, Hermetist, Hermeticist, those are the three forms of the word. Hermetica is the writings, the technical and the spiritual writings. Hermetist, people who follow that. Hermeticist, who harken back to the Renaissance Christianization and the verbo mirifico, the wonder-working word of Reuchlin, where you put the shin in the middle of the tetragrammaton, like Jesus was hiding there all along, and ta-da, Hermetic tradition. The Hermetic tradition was born in the Christian world. For more on that, you can see Antoine Fevre's seminal work, Access to Western Esotericism. That will go over all that quite well as most academic writings on Hermeticism. But what does Tomberg mean when he calls the Hermetic philosophy as a sense? When he says the Hermetic philosophical sense, first of all, I think if he was alive today and had access to Wouter Hanegraaff's new work on Hermetic spirituality, he would have probably called it Hermetic spirituality, because it was this prevailing idea and assertion that the Hermetica was a philosophy, series of philosophical texts. And a lot of us always were suspicious that it maybe was a bit more spiritual than philosophical. And Dr. Hanegraaff has put the nail in that coffin and put to bed the idea that the Hermetica texts are philosophical rather than spiritual. They're clearly designed to be coming out of a spiritual community that was practicing certain practices rather than an abstract philosophical tradition. So given his anthroposophical background, this is to do with Steiner and his teachings, it is hard to not hear evoked in Tomberg's conception of the Hermetic philosophical sense Rudolf Steiner's proposal of the 12 senses, each corresponding to, in anthroposophy, to the 12 signs of the zodiac, of course, and generally taught in Waldorf schools as part of the grade 9 biology curriculum, of course. He rules by means of the scepter, and by the scepter alone. This is why the first idea that the card naturally evokes is that of the authority underlying law. The thesis which proceeds from meditation on the three preceding arcana is that all authority has its source in the ineffable divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and that all law derives from this. Tomberg describes or ascribes 4 aspects of the emperor to the 4 letters of the tetragrammaton, the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the unpronounceable name of God, which then through self-emptying, or kenosis, as we call it in mystical theology, he allows the divine aspects to take root in place of what he has sacrificed. So Tomberg outlines these as such. The emperor has established in himself this fourfold emptiness. Very interesting. I hope that interests you as much as it does me. I find it a very unique take on this arcana. This is why he is the emperor. This is why he is authority. He has made a place in himself for the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is the source of authority. And here we see the mystical experience, which is corresponding to the first letter of Meditations on the Tarot, the Magus, the Gnostic revelation, which corresponds to the High Priestess, the second letter, the second arcanum, and the third arcanum, the Empress, which is sacred magic. But Tomberg, remarkably throughout that chapter and this chapter, really goes out of his way to point out that sacred magic is meant to be something enacted in service to people. And we'll see today here in this lecture how far, to what extent he means by that. And it's downright necromantic. And then finally, the last one, the corresponding to the emperor, is the hermetic sense, but he also calls it the initiate sense. And he says he has renounced personal intellectual initiative. and the emptiness which results is filled by divine initiative, or the yod of the sacred name. He has renounced action and movement, right? If you notice, he's not sitting on his chair, but he's not standing and his legs are crossed. And the void which results is filled by revelationary action and magical movement from above, i.e., by the He and the Vav of the divine name. Finally, he has renounced his personal mission. He has become anonymous, and the emptiness which results is filled with authority, or the second He of the divine name, i.e., he becomes the source of law and order. So it's through this emptying of the self, the emptying of personal desires, ambitions, and even action and movement, that divine authority flows in. Consider the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Or Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum. So God is powerful only insofar as his authority is freely recognized and accepted. Prayer is the act of such recognition and acceptance. And the Our Father is a really great example of this, because Tomberg says, he who prays these petitions does so solely with the purpose of affirming and increasing divine authority and not divine power, right? Prayer doesn't give us power, but prayer does relinquish and acknowledge this external reality that we call God and give power to it by emptying ourselves of the things that keep us distant from that kenosis, that process, which there's a really great, again, I encourage you to read the chapter and look at what how he describes that in terms of the crucifixion and symptom, but that would really be a whole lecture in and of itself to just look at it from that angle. So the God who is almighty, not virtually, but actually, has no need at all to be petitioned that his reign may come and that his will may be done, right? So the meaning of this prayer, the Our Father, is that God is powerful only insofar as his authority is freely recognized and accepted. Prayer is the act of such recognition and acceptance. One is free to be believing or unbelieving. Nothing and no one can compel us to have faith. No scientific discovery, no logical argument, no physical torture can force us to believe anything, as we were discussing before this lecture started, i.e., to freely recognize and accept the authority of God. But on the other hand, once this authority is recognized and accepted, the powerless becomes powerful, and then divine power can manifest itself. And this is why it is said that a grain of faith is sufficient to move mountains. So for Tomberg, let's get into what he really means by this hermetic philosophical sense, or initiate sense. He says, has more in common with the plain and sincere faith of simple people than abstract metaphysics has. For the common believer, God lives. Likewise, for the hermeticist, the believer addresses himself to saints and angels. For the hermeticist, they are real. The believer believes in miracles. The hermeticist lives in the presence of miracles. The believer prays for the living and the dead. The hermeticist dedicates all his efforts in the domain of sacred magic to the good of the living and the dead. There it is. The believer esteems all that which was traditional. The hermeticist does likewise. What more is there to say? Well, quite a bit, as it turns out. Tomberg continues, of course, by saying that the emperor owes his authority not to his power, of course, visible or invisible, over human beings, but rather because he represents them before God. And that's a key point. He represents them before God. He has authority not because he is superhuman, but rather because he is very human, because he represents all that which is human. And this makes sense, right? Who do we want to give authority to in our regular lives? People who represent us and represent who we are as fully as possible. As you don't want to give authority to someone who doesn't have any connection to your good, is not in right relationship to you. That would be an unethical representation of yourself, and therefore corrupt authority. And of course, that's what we see going on in the human world these days. The idea that we give power and authority to that which represents us is so timely. We can see how losing that sense that we are properly, let alone fully represented, brings the planet to the brink of even a third world war. And given Tomberg, born in 1900, lived through the Bolshevik Revolution. His family was chased out of Russia because they were lesser nobility. And then his mom was assassinated by the Red Guards for not giving up where he and his father were. Both world wars, and he lived through many other wars, dying in the 70s, of course. So he got to see part of Vietnam, the Korean War, and all of that sort of thing. So he also wrote extensively on these topics, including a spiritual analysis of how Hitler and National Socialism occurred on a spiritual and occult level. But that text, unfortunately, has been lost to time. How interesting it would have been to see his insights on that, given his life experience and spiritual background. He also became a lawyer when he was living in Germany. So just a masterful human being who, by all accounts, was one of the most delightful people you could ever be around, just full of life, full of warmth. A lot of the anthroposophists and the Goetheanum folks of the executive branch of Steiner's organization in Dornach, Germany, or Dornach, Switzerland, they sort of mocked him and his group as being a bit too touchy-feely, a bit too like friendly and loving, and they wanted to be a bit more cold and cool and in their comportment, which is kind of shocking, honestly. All right. So, yes, this reminds us a lot of the things he dealt with in his life, remind us a lot of the issues facing us today. And for Tomberg, these issues were at the very least in all of his life and works, what we might call, I suppose, top of mind. So to see them emerge in Meditations on the Tarot is not surprising. And if you think you're seeing a strand of some sort of insight as to lessons we could have learned from the troubles, the traumas of the 20th century, then you're correct. You're seeing what you think you're seeing. It's not him just accidentally, possibly commenting on some sort of social issue. He's doing it very intentionally, but also as surreptitiously as possible, so as not to really distract us from the more spiritual and elevated content of his tome. Now, Tomberg later in the chapter parenthetically also titles the Hermetic philosophical sense the initiate sense, as I've already said, and that it is that of concrete spiritual realities. That's what it is. It's the Hermetic philosophical sense. The initiate sense for Tomberg is of concrete spiritual realities. Now, what are concrete spiritual realities? We rarely associate spirit with concrete. They likely seem to be probably as opposed as two things can be. But simply said, the initiate sense. How does this function? He says there is reason to indicate in the first instance that it is not identical with what one customarily designates as metaphysical sense. So this is an interesting point, given post-New Age, metaphysics is a very popular word in spirituality, whereas, well, it was even 150 years ago, I suppose, but it seems to continually be more and more adopted by the New Age and more eschewed by philosophers. Most of 20th century philosophy was not doing metaphysics big time. So since the metaphysical sense of metaphysicians is the taste and capacity for living in abstract theories, the liking for the abstract, whilst the Hermetic philosophical sense is on the contrary due to the orientation towards the concrete, spiritual, psychic, physical. And Tomberg clarifies this, of course, to the nth degree. He says, whilst the metaphysical sense operates with the concept of God, the Hermetic philosophical sense, again, the word philosophical is just so out of place there right now. It would make so much sense to just completely gloss that over and start calling it the Hermetic spiritual sense, because that's what he would call it if he had access and were alive today and saw the research that has occurred in Hermetic studies. So the Hermetic philosophical sense is oriented towards the living God, the spiritual, concrete fact of God. He says the Christian celestial Father and the Ancient of Days of the Kabbalists is not an abstract concept. It is not a notion, but rather a being. Now we're getting to the really good stuff. So for Tomberg, this Hermetic sense is one that he says is only and always a practical sense. Great, right? It's a practical sense and is in contrast to the abstract, because through it we are engaging with entities of the spiritual hierarchies, and through them, the living God. For the initiate sense, the space between the supreme principle and the domain of facts is not peopled with laws and principles, but rather with living spiritual beings, each endowed with a manner, look, voice, way of speaking, and name. He allegedly never practiced ritual magic even once in his life, but he also addresses his letters to Dear Unknown Friend, which is a Martinist colloquialism, and Martinists practice heavy ritual magic and always have. Their order predated the Golden Dawn in a sense, or presaged it, because they're very similar, the Martinist orders and the Golden Dawn, and were focused on practical magic. And he was very good friends with the head of a Martinist order, a very famous one. But again, research will continue. I'll do part 2 of my biography lecture on Tomberg soon, and we'll see if I can have dug up any more to do with what he was actually up to in his personal practices. Because the thing we know for sure is if he was doing ritual magic on his own, he wouldn't have told anyone, or he wouldn't have let the public know ever. Plus, it kind of makes sense, because that's sort of he would have seen it as a personal choice and not the right choice for everyone, which is how, of course, a lot of us magicians see these things. So for the initiate sense, the space between the supreme principle and the domain of facts is not peopled with laws and principles, but rather with real beings. And he describes them as if he had practiced scrying and conjuration or evocation many, many times, if you see what I mean. For the initiate sense, the Archangel Michael is not a law or principle. He is a living being whose face is invisible because it has given place to the face of God. Yeah, that's my italics in that slide. Tomberg gets this from the literal meaning of Michael's name, of course, Michael, who is as God. Me is who. No one could endure the vision of the face of Michael because he is like unto God. Tomberg clarifies this. It is a matter here of the development and usage of the 4th spiritual sense, i.e., the Hermetic philosophical sense, following the development and usage of the mystical, Gnostic, and magical senses. The aptitude for knowing how to know is the characteristic trait essential to this sense. We have defined it above in the second letter on the high priestess as the sense of synthesis, because the high priestess represents gnosis that comes from mystical experience, and therefore synthesis necessarily, and the path of leading, well, in the Golden Dawn schema, the path of Gimel leading up from Tiferet to Kether, of course, is that conduit of synthesis, from the divine synthesis in the crown to the synthesis in Tiferet in the core of the tree, and the camel riding up and down between them, if you want to see it that way. We have defined it above as the synthesis rate. Now we are able to advance and to do so in a much more profound way in defining it as the initiate sense, or the sense of orientation and acquisition of knowledge of essential facts in every domain. That's what Tomberg calls it. But I thought it would be nice to have a visual image to understand this, because this is how he sees it here, as this balancing, but the transformation of the 3 into the 4. When you balance these 3 arcana, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and practice them, then you produce the 4th, which is a sense that these beings are really real and that you can interact with them, that they have voices and characteristics. He's all in on this idea that not only are spiritual entities, spiritual creatures, including us, real and concrete, we're the most concrete and real thing, because God is real. And through us and these other spiritual entities, we can know God, which is the most fundamental reality that exists. Nowhere a void, of course, is the Rosicrucian saying. And the Rosicrucian saying, nequaquam vacum, from the Fama Fraternitatis, I believe. So by actively engaging in these practices of mystical experience, unio mystica, revelation of gnosis, personal gnosis, as if it's redundant, I think, to say any other kind, but that's a debate that's for Facebook. And then magical effect, because the Empress represents sacred magic. And as we know from that previous lecture last month, even any grimoire, he says, could be appropriate for you to use if Jesus says so, or if your sense of God says so, which is shocking information to anyone familiar with Tomberg's biography. It's just quite a delight, and I'm so curious to find out if anyone else has noticed that in their readings. The initiate is one who knows how to attain knowledge. So knowing how to know is an idea that he got from Steiner, and this is a crucial thing within anthroposophical practices, knowing how to know. I've talked about this a lot on my podcast in the episodes that I selected from An Outline of Occult Science by Steiner. Though it's very hard to, it's somewhat impenetrable text too. I did my best to explain it, but I think it's it's a tricky one. So who knows how to ask, seek, and put into practice the appropriate means in order to succeed? Spiritual exercises alone have taught him. No theory or doctrine, however luminous, may in any way have rendered him capable of knowing how to know. You can only find this out through practice. It's great. This should be a magician's best friend, this text, but it's often relegated to I think some kind of postmodern Christian theosophical theory. Many people love this text, of course, but I think they don't engage with it enough to really get all the juice out of it that is in this wonderful thing. Spiritual exercises have taught him the practical sense, and in Hermetic philosophy, there is no other sense than the practical. So again, yeah, he sensed naturally that Hermeticism was not so much a philosophy, but a spirituality. It's just right there. He just couldn't say it because it was considered a philosophy, technically speaking, and he's an erudite man and didn't want to be called out. So, and the infallible effectiveness of the arcanum of the three united endeavors, which is the basis of every spiritual exercise in every arcanum. Namely, ask and it will be given you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. In this verse from the Gospel of Luke, Tomberg sees the magical formula ultimately exemplified: the openness to God, the going forth, and then the action to make it accomplished. Thus, Hermetic philosophy does not teach what one ought to believe concerning God, man, and nature, but it teaches rather how to ask, how to seek, how to knock in order to arrive at mystical experience, Gnostic illumination, and the magical effect of that which one seeks to know about God, man, and nature. And it is after having asked, sought, and knocked, and after one has received, found, and gained access, that one knows. This kind of knowing, the certainty of the synthetic comprehension of mystical experience and Gnostic revelation and magical effect, is the emperor. The emperor is the summation of all four of those things. This is the practical teaching of the fourth card of the tarot. Now, I'm not sure how closely the throngs who love this text have read it, given Tomberg, again, clearly advocates for not only the development of special skills and senses, but for the purpose of engaging with entities that are not only real, but more real than us, or at least as real. And through them, we experience God more fully, or perhaps at least in a way that allows us as Hermeticists to dedicate all of our efforts in the domain of sacred magic to the good of the living and the dead. This line from the text from page 95 is just too good to be believed, in fact, because he's talking about doing magic with the dead, for the dead. Whether you see this in a Roman Catholic sense to alleviate the time in purgatory, which is definitely there in his book and really appealing to the traditional Catholics out there, but it's also a way to sort of smuggle in Christological necromancy into your average Catholic mystic's diet. I hope some of you appreciate that as much as I do. So, because for the initiate sense, God is that which is most real and therefore most concrete. In fact, amongst all that exists, God is that alone which is absolutely real and concrete, whilst created beings are only relatively real and concrete. And what we designate as concrete fact is in reality only an abstraction from divine reality. So a lot could be said about that. He's not saying that I mean, in classical hermetism and in the Hermetica, it's seen that reality is sort of an illusion, that that's all there is light. Hermeticists or Hermetists tend to see the reality as light. God is light. This is why it works so well with Christianity, because Jesus was light in its most fundamental Gospel of Mystical John sense of things. If that light, if the fundamental nature of reality is illusory, but that illusion is God, then that's all that's real, and all there is illusion, of course. But what Tomberg is saying is that there is an ontological reality. It's just not the physical one. It's idealism in its finest, and just with a bit of nuance. He says Hermeticism is the rehumanization of all the elements of human nature. So it's a vivification and a purification through spirituality that we become real, in a sense. It is their return to their true essence, this purification. It's very similar to actually what happens in the Golden Dawn Neophyte initiation, with the separation of the elements representing the candidate, the purification of the candidate, and the harmonization of the candidate's sphere of sensation through the, of course, canopic gods of the Egyptian pantheon, Quebec, Snoof, and the sons of Horus, which represent in the Golden Dawn Temple the four aspects of the candidate. Just as all base metal can be transformed into silver and gold, Tomberg says, so are all the forces of human nature susceptible to transformation into silver or gold, i.e., into what they are when they share in the image and likeness of God. Very classic theurgy, of course, is what we overall see being denoted by the Emperor card. This self-emptying, this participation in God through acceptance of authority, and finally gaining a sense that these realities are real through the development of the other exercises of the first three arcana. The human ideal of practical Hermeticism is not the Superman of Nietzsche, nor the Superman of India plunged in contemplation of eternity, nor the Superman Hierophant of Gurdjieff, nor the Superman philosopher of the Stoic and Vedanta philosophies. No, its human ideal is the man who is human to such a degree that he contains and bears in himself all that which is human. Nietzsche said, right, I teach you the Superman or Overman or Higher Man, the Übermensch. Der Mensch ist etwas, das überwunden werden soll. Was habt ihr getan, ihn zu überwinden? What have you done to overcome who you are and participate in this higher reality? That's what Nietzsche meant by this. That is what he meant. There's a lot of connotations and results that come out of that, but essentially, this is what he was talking about. Tomberg is saying that you overcome yourself by becoming more fully yourself. So practical Hermeticism, he says, is alchemy. The ideal of Hermeticism is essentially and fundamentally the alchemical idea. This means to say the more one becomes truly human, the more one manifests the divine element underlying human nature, which is the image and likeness of God. The ideal abstraction invites human beings to do away with human nature, to dehumanize. Right? That's what abstraction does. But experience and practical interaction with these entities makes us more human. Engaging with spirits and God through spirits makes us more human. In contrast, the ideal of alchemical transformation of Hermeticism offers to human beings the way to the realization of true human nature, which is the image and likeness of God. All right, we're getting toward the end here, but that is the main idea I wanted to focus on in this lecture, is really unpacking what he means by this Hermetic philosophical sense. The first two times over the last, back in 2000 and then in a few years ago, when I've worked through this book, this is my third working through of this text. The first time I really glossed over that and focused on very, very different things. So it's been quite a joy to look at this from the perspective of what is most important for me, not to get out of this text right now for myself, but what's most important, do I think, to share from this text with others. And so that's what I'm doing in this series of 22 lectures from now till whenever I get it done. um, and look at it from this different perspective, and it's opening up new elements and dimensions up within the text that I never saw the first time. Like I never noticed his sort of workaround for justifying goetic magic or grimoire practices in the Empress, and I never saw in the Emperor card previously this whole really nuanced and powerful interpretation of the initiate sense, as he calls it, which I think is just this beautiful summation of the results of doing these other exercises and focusing on them. And these are exercises, as you can see, that can exist within any tradition. These are not, this is certainly, none of this is limited to Kabbalah or Christianity or Roman Catholicism or anything. These are things that could be applied to any tradition because of the fact that they are methodological approaches, just as much as they are uh, postulations on the nature of reality. So, no. New mug I got for my birthday from my best friend. I know, I thought you'd like that. No, the post of the emperor does not belong any longer either to those who desire it or to the choice of the people. It is reserved to the choice of heaven alone. It has become a cult, and the crown, the scepter, the throne, the coat of arms of the emperor are to be found in the catacombs. In the catacombs. This means to say under absolute protection. Tomberg, I think, doesn't believe in worldly authority at this point anymore. When he was writing this book, I think he had given up on that idea. And I think that's why he had no problem with dealing with ideas of the Pope or spiritual leaders, because he really did see them as symbols that either worked practically and effectively or didn't. Now, the emperor of the fourth arcanum of the tarot does not have a sword or any other weapon. He rules by means of the scepter and by the scepter alone. And I wanted you to get a chance just to really focus on what the card looks like with the scepter, the shield, the throne, and the crown. Excuse me. The shield bearing an eagle rests on the ground at his side. This is, of course, the same shield we saw with the Empress. The Emperor does not hold it with his hand, as the Empress does. The shield is certainly there, but it belongs rather to the throne than to the person of the Emperor. This means to say that the purpose for which the Emperor is on sentry duty is not his, but that of the throne. And if we see the throne in terms of the Empress as being sort of concurrent with nature, or even symbolic of nature, I do like to see the Empress card as and her throne as sort of representative of the Shekinah, the body of God, the presence of God on earth. And here it's specified that this shield, which is of course the results of sublimation and alchemical transformation and rising up to God, is not possessed by authority. It doesn't fall under the purview of the emperor in any strict or controlling sense. It is more to do with the empress, but it still plays a part in the emperor. So that's an interesting thing to observe. I think that Tomberg noted that the emperor is basically just touching it with his foot. The emperor is therefore renounced all action, having pledged his right hand to the scepter that he holds before him, whereas his left hand holds his fastened belt. So what he guards is fundamentally the scepter. That's his main thing, is protecting the symbol of divine authority. The scepter is not an implement with which one is empowered to do something or other. It is, from a practical point of view, a symbol serving nothing. The emperor has therefore renounced all action, having pledged his right hand to the scepter and holding his belt with the other, so that he's no longer free and has restrained himself by becoming fully representative of what we all are. It serves the function of holding the impulsive and instinctive nature of the emperor in check, so that it does not intervene and divert him from his post as guardian. That's as guardian, not Asgardian. Little Norse joke for you. The crown of the emperor signifies the renunciation of freedom of intellectual movement. I find that very interesting because, again, our abstracts, thoughts in our mind can carry us away, and it does sometimes seem at odds with the spiritual pursuit. And this goes back, of course, to the classic sort of Zoharic writers and versus Maimonides, which Zevi talks about on Seekers of Unity, his wonderful YouTube channel. Renunciation of freedom of action and movement. He is deprived of the so-called natural liberties of the human being, those of opinion, word, and movement. Authority demands this. If only. Okay. Lastly, authority is the magic of spiritual profundity filled with wisdom. Or in other words, it is the result of magic based on gnosis due to mystical experience. Authority is the second hey of the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, but it is not the second hey taken separately. It is only when the whole divine name manifests itself. For this reason, it is more correct to say that authority is the completely manifested divine name. I want to leave you, though, with this final thought that doesn't really fit into the overall flow of the major themes I decided to exegete from this text today, but it is such a good quote. I needed to bring it up because I think it's one worth highlighting. He says, it goes without saying that nobody initiates anyone else, right? So you can see how this ties into the emperor a bit, but it's slightly off the angle that I decided to take hermeneutically today. So if we understand by initiation the mystery of the second birth or the great sacrament, this initiation is operative from above and has the value and the duration of eternity. The initiator is above, and here below one meets only the fellow pupils, and they recognize each other by the fact that they love one another. I love that. I love that idea. This is the idea so fundamental to our approach, no matter what hermetic order you're in. There tends to be a fundamental idea that we are all friends. We're here as friends. We're here because we love each other and we want to share and love, actively loving to help each other in this life together. It's not the hierarchical structures of dominance are really antithetical to the true hermetic gesture. Tomberg says that there are no longer any more masters because there is only one soul master who is the initiator above. To be sure, there are always masters who teach their doctrines and also initiates and also initiates who communicate some of the secrets which they possess to others, who thus become in their turn the initiates. But all this has nothing to do with the mystery of the great initiation.